Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, where are we, sir?
It's been a few weeks, Dawn. I think at least 3 weeks since we were in Revelation 10. We finished up chapter 10. I think it was the week before last. We were going to get into chapter 11. Uh, but as I'll explain, chapter 11 is a very difficult chapter. And there were so few of us here 2 weeks ago, and we had our break last week that I didn't want those two things to be a factor in our retention of chapter 11. So we postponed getting into chapter 11 2 weeks ago. Then we had our break last week, our church breakfast. And so this week we'll begin chapter 11. And uh, we're not going to make very much headway. In fact, I think we'll probably look at only two verses, the first two verses of chapter 11. Don't let that scare you. I'm not going to take that same pace through the entire chapter. I intend to try to get through the remaining part of chapter 11 next week. It may be that we get down through verse 14 next week and finish it out the following week. We'll just see how it goes. But this morning, we're just going to look at verses 1 and 2. But I do want to read the text. I want to read starting in verse 1, and we'll read down through verse 14, as that is the most relevant portion of chapter 11 for our text this morning. This is immediately following chapter 10, where we saw the angel with the little scroll in his hand, his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. And John is told to eat that little scroll. He was going to taste as sweet as honey in his mouth, but make his stomach bitter. That's where we were last time. So in verse 1 of chapter 11, John writes, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. They have the power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague, as often as they desire. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some from the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these two prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. But after 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven, saying to them, 'Come up here.' And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. And at that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come." So that is the end of the sixth trumpet, or the second woe. And the seventh trumpet, or the third woe, is the remaining portion of chapter 11, which we'll try to get to next week. This morning, we're going to look at verse 1 and 2. That is the temple, the measuring of the temple. What does that signify? And the leaving out of the outer court, not to be measured, but to be trampled. That's about as far as we'll get. And then next week, we'll focus on the two witnesses. Who are these two witnesses? What is done to them, and what is their ultimate destination. That's kind of the plan. So again, we are taking the preterist position in Revelation. That means that necessarily we are doing combat with the futurist position. The preterist position for Revelation is that virtually all of the prophecies given in Revelation are in our past. They were in John's future when they were given to John, but they occurred shortly after John was given these prophecies, and more specifically before 70 AD. With just a very small handful of the prophecies in Revelation still in our future. So I would take a futurist position on those. But for the vast majority of Revelation, these events described to us are in our past. So the final return of Christ, the final bodily return of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, I take those to be still in our future. I take the futurist position on those small handful of prophecies in Revelation as still in our future. But almost everything else in Revelation is in our past. That's the preterist position. The futurist position, again, is that virtually all of Revelation is still yet to come, still in our future. Yes, future in John's day when he was given these prophecies, of course, future in his day, but even now the futurist says all of Revelation is still in our future. So if we were to put the sequence of events as described by the futurist on a timeline, I would put the church age, the rejection of Christ, the pausing of the prophecy clock, and the beginning of the church age as the beginning of the futurist scheme or sequence of events. So according to the futurist, we are in the church age. Now, I would agree with that. As far as that is concerned, I would agree that we are, yes, in the church age. Where I would disagree with the futurist is that God intended to deal with Israel always and forever. And that when Christ came and Israel, the ethnic nation of Israel, rejected their Messiah, God pressed the pause button on the prophecy clock and began a brand new, completely separate thing called the church. And God is now dealing no longer with Israel, but now exclusively with the church, the Gentile church. And at some point in the future, the church is going to be raptured off the earth, and God is going to hit the unpause button on the prophecy clock, and all of the prophecies dealing with Israel are going to start to occur again. And that's when the Antichrist arises. That's when the 7-year tribulation happens, so on and so forth. So what the futurist would say concerning Revelation 11 is that, of course, this is all in our future. John is given a rod to measure the temple. Well, there is no temple, right? And so what we must be talking about is a future rebuilt third temple that hasn't been rebuilt yet. That's obviously in our future, because there has to be a rebuilt temple for John in the future to measure the temple. That's our focus this morning. Is the futurist right about that? So let's look at chapter 10 from the preterist view. Before we do that, let's flip back to chapter 10 and just remind ourselves where we just were in our text. In verse 1, John sees Jesus as the light of the world. Jesus appears to John as the light of the world. In verse 2, John sees a little scroll in Jesus' hand. And he also sees that Jesus has his right foot on the Gentile nations and his left foot on Israel. And I believe that is symbolizing his all-encompassing authority over Jew and Gentile alike. Jesus in chapter 10 swears by the creator of all things that there will be no more delay. There will be no more delay. The mystery of God would now be fulfilled. And then John is told to eat the little scroll. It will taste like honey in his mouth, but it'll make his stomach bitter. And I believe that this is the mystery of God that was to be revealed. Jesus says to John, no more delay. The time has come. The mystery of God is finally going to be fully revealed. And that mystery of God we looked at, I think 3 weeks ago, is the inclusion of the Gentiles into the peoples of God. Or you might say the union of Jewish believers and Gentile believers into one body. And that partition wall of hostility is broken down, making one new man. That was the mystery that was revealed. And for John, seeing that would have been sweet and bitter at the exact same time. It would have been sweet in that John now sees God's plan of redemption begin to expand and include not just the Jewish nation, but the entire world, all the Gentile nations as well. John would have seen that as a beautiful thing. But it also would have been bitter in his stomach because of what must take place for that to happen. And that is the removal of all the obstacles that had stood in the way of that mystery being fully revealed. That's the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the earthly sacrificial system that cleansed no one's sin. All of that that John had known his entire life had to be stripped from planet Earth for this mystery of the inclusion of the Gentiles to be made manifest. And that was going to be hard for John. So now we get to chapter 11. And what the assertion that I'm making is that what's in view here is not some future earthly, Jerusalem-centric, physical, made by hands temple that has yet to be built, that John is going to measure in the future. That's not what's in view. What's in view is the end of the old covenant. The end of the old covenant system. Well, when did the end of the old covenant system occur? Somebody besides Darren.
At the cross.
70 AD.
Or there,
Yes and yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Yeah. The death, burial, and resurrection of Christ and all the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, all of the events from the cross, the death and resurrection of Christ, up to and including the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That is the end of the old covenant system. And I did a survey, a brief survey of the New Testament to gather language out of the New Testament concerning that old covenant system. How does the New Testament speak of the old covenant system? And I gathered some descriptions here. The old covenant was faulty. Hebrews 8:7. It was a ministry of death. 2 Corinthians 3:7. It was veiled. 2 Corinthians 3:14. It was earthly and fleshly. Hebrews 9, verses 1 and 10. It bore only children for slavery. Galatians 4:24. The old covenant system was set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. Hebrews 7:18. It perfected nothing. Hebrews 7:19. It was but a shadow of good things to come. Hebrews 10:1. It was a shadow of good things to come, meaning it was not the good thing. It was a shadow only of good things to come. Was only a constant reminder of sin. Hebrews 10:3. And for all these reasons was obsolete, growing old, and ready to vanish away. Hebrews 8:13. I could have added more to that list, but that's a pretty good list to get an understanding of how that old covenant system was viewed by the New Testament writers, is it not? It had its purpose, it had its time, but that time was over. It served its purpose and was now rendered obsolete. What do you do, Don? What do you do when something's obsolete?
Toss it.
What?
Toss it out.
Toss it out. Cast it out. We're going to talk about that in our text this morning. Cast it out. And you don't need to turn there, but again, I could have added more to this list, but the evidence and the timing is clear all throughout the New Testament that this is a major component of the New Testament message, that the old is ready to vanish away. The time for the end is near. Jesus said that to the woman at the well, did he not? Starting in chapter 4, verse 20, she says to Jesus, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here." If there ever was a timing indicator that helps us understand the timing that is to be expected by Christ's followers, it's here. Jesus is clear to her. He says, an hour is coming. In fact, it's already here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Far be it from me to add words to Jesus's words, but you might even say, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth, and not in buildings made with hands. Joy.
I have a question. I just want to, seems like all that you've said so far about the old covenant, something's been made real clear um, to me. So I want to ask if I'm on the right track. I think that we have had a long history under Larry of misunderstanding. It wasn't his fault. It was our own um, somewhat misunderstanding where, at least for me, I always just, old covenant just meant law. Just law. That's what old covenant means. It's just law. And only law. And that's over. But the way that you've worded it, and we've already come to this, but it's made more clear now. It's that, and I'm asking, is this right? It's the system. The old covenant that's no longer. It's the way God worked with the law, and the reason why it was faulty is because nobody could do it. So now, new covenant, the law's still there. It's just a different system. So I think that was my misunderstanding, is just always equating old covenant. All old covenant means is just law. And we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I think I will speak for myself. There certainly was a misunderstanding on my part of what Larry taught in the past concerning the old covenant, and that verse that I read about the old covenant being a shadow of good things to come. So there was some goodness about it. It wasn't the good thing, right? But a good thing can only cast a shadow that represents that good thing. So a monster is going to cast a bad shadow that you should be afraid of. It's nothing but bad because it tells you a monster is near. And the old covenant system, I don't think we as Christians should look at that as pure evil, it came from God, right?
Right.
There's some goodness, and for its time and purpose, some usefulness. But because of man's sin, it's only because of man's sin that it was useless and weak. Does that make sense? And God knew that. God determined that the system would be abused by sinful men so that he could provide for himself the sacrifice of Christ. He knew what we were going to do with law. And he did that so that he could bring his son to die for the sins that we cannot ourselves atone for through law. Bo.
The problem, like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with, absolutely, like, with all the law. All the law is holy, right? It is holy. It is the word of God.
Amen.
It is God's will.
Psalm 119.
Yeah, it is all God's will. It is perfect. It is holy. The problem is with the execution, the executor of the will, right? The executor of the will in the old covenant was man. The executor of the will in the new covenant is Christ and the Holy Spirit, right? That's where the problem was. It's not that those laws are like abolished. or defunct, like murder's suddenly fine now, or
Yeah.
adultery, or all those, covetousness, or all those things. Those things are still as holy today
Yep.
and as important today as they have ever been. Right? The problem was with the execution of the plan, the execution of the will of God. And now that plan is executed is by Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. And
Right.
this
Great.
is perfect.
Yep. Did you have something?
Yeah.
It looked like your hand was halfway kind of raised.
I was thinking the law is just as much an attribute of God as his love, his grace. Like the law, I think we look at Leviticus and Deuteronomy and you're like, man, God just has so many things that he is like asking of us, like telling us to do. And I think you can get a disposition of like, kind of like the dad figure of like just stern. But I think part of it is like him looking down and being like, hey guys, I am a righteous being. And I would love for you to be in my presence. And to be with you, I'm gonna need you to execute these things. Otherwise you're gonna perish. Like you can't be with me doing all this sin. It it doesn't work. And so over and over again, I think even through giving the law, you also see implicitly like his mercy because he's like, okay, let's run it back. Let's run it back. Let's do it again. And then I thought of like in Genesis where um Abraham's pleading with God about like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he like asks him like, hey, if there's like 100 good people, are you gonna smite it? And he's like, there's 100, like it'll be fine. He's like, okay, cool, like 20, 10, and he walks him down. And then it reminded me of like the covenant he made with Abraham, he put him to sleep. And so instead of being an original covenant where it's like, hey, we would both be accursed, he was like, I'm gonna carry the team. I will be a curse if this is broken. And it was. And so Christ was cursed on our behalf. So the law is just as quintessential to God as his love is. And I think it also comes to the fact of like you couldn't you couldn't see the full array and facet of God's attributes without sin. You couldn't have had grace. Without the law, you couldn't have seen the love.
Yeah.
So I think it was in place with the undertones present the whole time. And then finally, he's like, the law's not going to go away. Nothing in my word is going to pass away, but I'm going to complete it on your behalf. And so you're still within the old covenant, but it's now new because my blood is covering it forever. That was my internal thought for you.
I like all of that.
Yeah.
Yep. That just to be more specific on my misunderstanding of Larry, and I wasn't the only one. I know I wasn't the only one, but righteousness apart from the law, sign me up. Sign me up for some of that. But what the misunderstanding was in Larry's very strong and biblical preaching against the law for righteousness was for me to just jettison the law completely. I don't need that. I got grace.
That's what happened. It was almost a defense, right? It's how I interpret it, right? We're not under law, we're under grace. How many times have you heard that exact sentence? We are not under law, we are under grace. And so with that, jettison is a good word. It's like the law, get out of here, right? Like it's like if you're getting accused of something, it's almost like you have to be being accused of something to use that line, right? And so I did. I struggled with that for many years.
When you were reading in Acts this morning, starting in verse 30, they had the Jerusalem Council. They determined, hey, we're not going to put them under this burden, but hey, there are some things we need you guys to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Wrote that in a letter to them. So when they were sent off, they went down to Antioch, and having gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter. And when they had read it, they said, I'm not under law, I'm under grace.
Right.
No, they rejoiced. They rejoiced.
Well, it's good to live by the law. The law is good for you to live, but it's
Not
Christ's
for
blood.
righteousness.
It's Christ's blood that
Right.
saved, you know,
Yeah.
will
Yep.
take us to heaven, not
Yes.
following, not
Yes.
following the path of the law.
Right.
It's certainly, like, that's the thing. It's certainly beneficial. Like, that's so, like, so some of the laws are so practical. You know, it's certainly beneficial not to covet, right? Or to try to procure your neighbor's wife. You know, that's calamity untold, right? Like, certainly beneficial to you.
Equal weights and measures. Do we like equal weights and measures?
Exactly.
That's part of the law.
Fair trade. You know, like all these things are good.
Right.
It was with the execution.
For righteousness.
Yeah.
Yep. Dawn.
Well, if you really think about it and look at it, part of the reason for the law was to show us and convict us of our guilt, because we cannot any way be possible for us to live up to the law. And it points us to Christ for our salvation and not ourselves.
Yep.
That's a good point.
Yep. And now that salvation has been granted to me, where else would I look but to God's law to know what's good and holy and beneficial? Where else would I look? Am I going to look to my government? Am I going to look to my public school system? Where else am I going to look? It's a beautiful, wonderful thing that we as sovereign grace Christians, standing firm on justification by faith alone, apart from works of the law, we're going to stand firm there. But let us learn to love God's law. I don't know how we got off on all of that, but that was good. Thank you, Joy.
Well, it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing thing.
It is a good reminder for us.
Yeah.
So Joel Osteen's not going to get us to heaven.
Joel's not
But-
going to get his ribs.
But on the same note, though, I mean, just as important, it is very sad and unfortunate, I guess, that so many people don't know the other side of that, where it's severe, it's dangerous, to count on following the law for righteousness.
Yep.
To the point where Sarah said to Abraham, "Get him out, get her and her son out." And that was a picture of how severe it is.
Yep.
And that was Larry's whole.
Yep.
It's-
And that's for justification and sanctification.
Yeah.
We're not sanctified by the law either.
Yeah.
We're sanctified by gazing into the face of Jesus Christ. You want to be more sanctified as a Christian? Get in his word and find Jesus Christ.
It's that trap. It's the legalism, antinomianism pendulum that
Yeah.
you get into.
Yeah.
And nobody here that I know have been burdened by the legalism extreme for quite a while.
Yeah.
For quite a while.
Well, even you guys. Even you guys. Well, even you guys. Well, even you. Before we all came here and sat under Larry,
Well, certainly early on.
I thought I had to be a good little Christian before I met. I mean, that's how you get to heaven,
I knew I
right?
couldn't, so I was just being wild. There ain't no chance.
No hope for you. So you might as well
I
go down the path all the way.
Yeah.
So the end of the old covenant is what's in view here. The end of the old covenant. And there are two elements that are necessary to bring that old covenant to an end, and that is the judgment brought upon unbelieving, unfaithful, prostitute-like whore that she was, Israel. The rightful judgment that God brought upon her. The other element is the preserving of those first Christians who were Jewish. Chronologically. So we've got a judgment and we've got a preservation. That's what's in view. And we're running out of time, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here. But remember, I believe that the seal judgments that we read about earlier in Revelation and these trumpet judgments are two descriptions of the same events, just from different perspectives. Remember that big fancy theological word, recapitulation. And so in between the sixth and seventh seal, we had an interlude there where the 144,000 were sealed on their foreheads and protected. Well, that mirrors or parallels what we find in the trumpet judgments. So in between the sixth and seventh trumpet judgment, we have had an interlude. That's where we've been in chapter 10 and the first part of chapter 11. And here we have that sealing, that preserving, that protecting of God's people within the Jewish community. Those first Christians who were Jewish. That's what we're looking at. So what is John told to measure? Let's look in verse 1 of chapter 11 of Revelation. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. John is told to measure three things: the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But we want to be more specific when we talk about the temple of God, what John was measuring. It wasn't the entire temple complex that John was measuring. It was much narrower. It was a much narrower thing that John was measuring. It was the Holy of Holies. It was the innermost sanctuary of the temple. Measure that, John, along with the altar. That would be the altar of incense, and the people who worship there. Measure that. But don't measure, verse 2, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. So we've got a measuring and a not measuring. The not measuring is the court outside the temple. I'll just go ahead and spill beans. That's the court of the Gentiles. That's the court of the Gentiles. So when Solomon built his temple, he arranged for there to be a place for the Gentiles to approach God. That was the outermost court of the temple complex. John is told, don't measure that. Don't measure that. Now, why? Why is there measuring going on? What does measuring signify? Measuring can mean that you are being marked out for destruction. We won't turn there, but write in your notes, please, Amos 7, verses 7 through 9. This is an example of being marked out for destruction. You can be measured so that all that needs to be destroyed is destroyed. You can also be measured to be marked out for preservation. Zechariah 1, verse 16. Or you can be measured for both reasons. An example of that would be 2 Samuel 8, verses 1 and 2. the measuring takes place for both destruction on the one hand and preservation on the other hand, depending on who it is, how you measure up. 2 Samuel 8, verses 1 and 2. In this example, in our text, this measuring that's taking place that John is told to accomplish is for the preservation of the Jewish Christians who worship God properly. Those Jewish Christians who worship God properly. I have to turn here, even though we're out of time. Who would be an example of a Jewish person that worshiped God properly?
Of a Jewish person that worships God properly. You're talking about like Jewish lineage, like Jewish, like
Who is an ethnic Jew who worshiped God properly?
bunch of them.
Yeah, there was a bunch of them.
Paul.
Paul?
Yep. Paul.
Yeah. Matthew?
Right.
Yeah, we could just spend all afternoon naming Jews who worship God properly. There were Jews who did not worship God properly. And Paul, an example of a Jew who worshiped God properly, warned in Philippians 3, starting in verse 2, look out for the dogs, look out for the evildoers, look out for those who mutilate the flesh. Who's that? Who are those that mutilate the flesh?
What the served Baal did.
Right,
Yeah, right there in the fire, they started cutting themselves.
right. Who else mutilated the flesh? The Jews. Paul goes on to say, for we are the circumcision.
Yeah. The new converts that were trying, or the Jews that were trying to get like it just happened in like 13 or 14 in Acts, where they were trying to get them to the new converts to circumcise themselves.
Yeah. Paul is warning his readers, beware of those Jews who mutilate the flesh, because they do not worship God properly. They say they do, but they do not. For it is us who worship God properly. We are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. Paul then even points to his Jewishness, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. They want to talk about all the reasons why they think that they worship God properly, and the things that they point to are the very things that I can claim, only more so than they. Though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. There is a Jew who worships God properly. And that Jew was warning everyone else, beware of these false Jews. They do not worship God properly. But there were Jews that did worship God properly, and they stood facing the temple of God. They stood facing the Holy of Holies. When an animal was sacrificed on the altar, when blood was shed for their sins, They could see through that blood. They could see through that sacrifice. They didn't gaze at the sacrifice as if that bull or goat was the thing that was dealing with their sin. They didn't do that. The Jews that worship God properly looked through that sacrifice at the sacrifice that God would provide for himself. And so when they saw the Lamb of God walking on earth, they said, there he is. That's my sacrifice. And those group of Jewish believers, they were measured. They were measured by John for preservation. And all of those Jews who did not worship God properly, who had their back to the Holy of Holies, they were standing in the court of Gentiles selling animals for their man-made system that had nothing to do with Judaism. Their system had grown so oppressive that they had encroached on the court of the Gentiles, the very place that was provided for the nations, the Gentile nations, to come and approach God. The Jewish system that had evolved by human means had pushed them out. So when Jesus came in to Jerusalem, what's the first thing he did? He walked into that court of Gentiles and saw all of those false Jews who do not worship God properly and said, get out of here, and started turning over tables and swinging his whip around. It was the most beautiful example of Christ's righteous anger and violence against false worship of God. And he said, you guys get out of here. And he cast them out. It's those people that are not measured in John's vision. Don't measure that portion. Why? Do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. You could say cast that out. That's what it literally means. Cast that out. He's not simply saying, don't measure that part. He's saying don't measure it and cast it out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. We're almost done. I want verse 2 to be ringing in your ears as I read this verse. Let me read verse 2 again. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. You remember back in Luke 21, when Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple. The section heading in my Bible says, Jesus foretells destruction of Jerusalem. In verse 24, they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Those verses are related. They must be. Luke 21:24, Revelation 11:2. Go home in your spare time, in your private reading time. Read those two side by side multiple times and tell me those verses are not related. Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple in Luke 21 and then says those words in verse 24. It will be trampled by the Gentiles. This is what John is talking about in Revelation 11. It is those events that happened just before 70 AD. This is not talking about some future third temple that has yet to be built, that will be built in the first half of the Great Tribulation. That's not what's in view in chapter 11. This is in our past. This has already occurred. The city was trampled by the Gentiles from early spring of AD 67 to November of AD 70. Depending on how you count when it started and when it stopped. I think we're more definitive on when it stopped, when it ended, than when it started. But I can make an argument for when I think John would have started counting. But how many months do you suppose the Jewish war lasted? What, Don?
42.
Now, I think that number in Revelation is symbolic. I do think it's symbolic. We're going to look at this number quite a number of times. We see it as 42 months. We see it as 1,260 days. We see it as 3.5 years, or time, a time and times and half a time. That's 3.5 years. We see it multiple times throughout the Revelation. And I do believe there's a symbolicness to that number. If 7 is regarded as a sacred number, then 3.5 is a broken 7. That which is not sacred. I do believe that there's a symbolic nature to this number 42. But that it's symbolic does not negate the possibility of it also having a literal component to it as well. And I believe both to be true regarding this 42 months. I can't get to application unless you guys want to stay here till 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So
I don't want to.
we'll get to application next week. But the one thing I'll say about this is if the futurist position is true, then Revelation is scary. It just is. But if the preterist position is true, the things that were opened up to you Gentiles in this room, think about it. Think about it. 2,000 years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, did we all not have things to do this afternoon that we could have gotten to? Well, we could have caught up on our sleep. We could have caught up on our binge watching. It's all kinds of things that we all could have done, and yet we all chose to come here to be with each other, to talk about Christ, because we have been included into the family of God because this old covenant system was wiped off the face of the earth forever. And Revelation becomes only beautiful whenever you take the preterist position like we are this morning. Darren has a prayer request for his nephew, Jason Deal. And he's 44 years old. He has several different types of cancer, brain cancer most recently. He's having seizures. He's in the ICU and likely to die very soon. And we think not a Christian. Please keep Jason in your prayers throughout the week, that God would afford some opportunity for the gospel to be preached to him, and that he would hear and believe before he goes on to meet his judge.